Welcome back with a smiling face. Links to previous episodes are given in the video description, so don't forget to like, subscribe and share the video. The Edge of Tomorrow. Episode 4. Chapter 28. Kate, it wasn't our intention to find Claire in the forest, but once we caught her scent it was nearing impossible to stop. Alec and I locked eyes, our wolves inhaling the creamy scent of their mate. She was sitting by herself, her back against a large tree. The sunlight peered through the trees, hitting her in the perfect spot. Her chocolate hair was glowing under the sunlight, looking like freshly spun silk. The sun brightened her unique eyes, making them radiate with color. "Are you going to eat me or not?" she huffed, her face impassive as she looked at my brother and I. There was no fear in her eyes, just the acceptance that her life could possibly end today. That fact sent a sharp ringing pain throughout my body, sending the memory of the night we ran into her rushing to the front of my mind. She was stumbling down the sidewalk. Alec and I noticed her before she saw us. She looked out of her mind with fear, the kind of fear that makes people do dangerous things. Her face was swollen, our mate was hurt. Something had changed about Claire in that short time. She smelled different, stronger than normal. Her scent was swirling around us, amplified by some unseen force. It was clear something happened inside the house, something Claire couldn't bear to talk about. She stumbled away from us, begging us to leave her alone. What happened to her? Alec snarled through the mind link. His eyes were racking up and down her body, trying to assess the damage done to her. Someone hurt her. I growled lowly, and they will die for what they've done. From what we could tell, only her face had been harmed. I let my gaze travel lower, noticing her jeans were unbuttoned and the zipper was down. I could feel my body tremble, fighting against the urge to shift. Alec followed my line of sight and began his own battle. Fighting the urge to shed our skin and hunt down the person who harmed our mate. Claire's fear helped us maintain control. She needed us right now, whether she knew it or not. Alec was the first to speak, and I watched pain rack my brother as Claire stumbled away from him. Leave me alone!" she hissed, much like a frightened kitten. Please just leave me alone." Claire took off running, bounding into the woods. Her speed was impressive considering her booted foot and swollen eye, just another thing that didn't quite add up. "Follow her." I turned to Alec, "Remain hidden, don't approach her. Just make sure she gets home safely." Determination mixed with the pain in Alec's eyes, and he bounded into the woods after our terrified mate. Every cell in my body wanted to follow, to be the one that made sure Claire made it home safely, but I couldn't. I needed to figure out what happened, figure out who hurt Claire. Her terror-filled face would haunt my dreams from now on, that I was sure of. Unique eyes that should have been filled with love and light were filled with terror and pain. I spent over an hour walking around the house, trying to get a grasp of what happened to our mate. Only one person was able to give me anything helpful. A girl with girly hair and dark espresso skin informed me Claire came to the party with a friend of hers, Autumn. I searched the house for Autumn, coming up short. If she had come to the party with Claire, she wasn't here now. A light hand ran over my shoulder, and I knew who it was without looking. The smell of perfume and hairspray wafted into my nose, making me grimace. Alec had given me hell for letting Claire think I was still with Grace. Thinking back on it, I couldn't see why I was ever with her to begin with. Hell, I couldn't see why I was with anyone other than Claire. Everyone else was simply a cheap imitation of her, and I craved the real thing. "I'm so glad you could make it," Grace purred, placing both hands on my shoulders as she lifted on her toes. "Not now," I snapped, anger filling me. I removed her hands from my shoulders, even the thought of touching her skin disgusted me. You seem stressed. She purred, in a way I'm sure she thought was very seductive. At one point, I might have been fooled. Grace had always been easy, nothing more. I made no false promises to Grace, and never told her anything more than the truth. Love was not a factor in our relationship, and neither were emotions. I'm sure there's an empty room around here somewhere. She giggled, her voice raising 4 octaves. She wrapped her manicured claw around my wrist and tried pulling me towards one of the bedrooms. Something in her eyes made me stop. They looked wide, and she was exuding just a little too much desperation. As though her life depended on what she was doing. Before she could even blink, I had her slammed against the dry wall. My eyes never left hers, even as a long crack formed in the wall. Her eyes were bulging from her head, my hand wrapped securely around her skinny throat. Grace. Her name was a snarl rolling off my lips, dripping with disgust and fury. I will only ask once. Did you touch Claire? Grace sputtered for a few moments, her face turning a deep shade of purple. I loosened my grip, realizing I had nearly killed her in my blinding anger. Claire. Grace spat. It wasn't a secret Grace disliked Claire. Why would I touch her? Her eyes were bright and defensive. I had to give it to Grace. She pulled herself together skillfully after almost being choked to death. Have you seen her tonight? I forced my voice to remain calm, but let my eyes burn with my true emotions. I was looking for blood tonight. She's here. Grace spat. Great. I turned away from Grace without another word. There were still more people to talk to. I planned on speaking to each and everyone, determined to know who had eyes on Claire. You came all this way. Grace whined, why don't you just hang out with me? I didn't come for you. I kept my eyes forward as I walked away, refusing to spare Grace another glance. She's home safe. Alex's voice flooded through my mind. A thick sense of relief washed through me. Good. I nodded. All I've learned is that Claire came here with a girl named Autumn. No one else saw her there. Alec grunted, his voice thick with irritation. So far, no luck. I grimaced, feeling the same. I'm not leaving until I speak with everyone here. Someone saw her, I know it. I found myself in the kitchen, attempting to speak with a girl who had far too much to drink. Claire. She slurred, no, I'm Rachel. Have you seen Claire? I pinched the bridge of my nose, exhaling sharply in a poor attempt to remain patient. I don't know who that is. The girl slurred, giving me a shrug before stumbling to the side. You can call me Claire if you want though. Long brown hair. I closed my eyes, seeing her in my head. She was wearing a long-sleeve shirt and jeans. I'm sure you would have noticed that. Every girl at this party was dressed to impress, wearing short form-fitting dresses and heels. Claire was the only one dressed down, dressed for comfort. Oh, that chick! The girl hiccuped, but my attention was captured. Where did you see her? The words left my lips in a rush as I towered over the drunk girl intimidatingly. Carson picked her up from the floor. The girl shrugged, chick was wasted real good. A grimace formed on my face. Claire wasn't drunk, that much was clear when we ran into her. Alec and I would have been able to smell it rolling off her lips. She wasn't drunk, and yet she was on the floor? The name Carson registered in my mind, sending possessive jealousy through me. It was no coincidence another man held her in his arms, and she runs from the house with her pants unbuttoned. My vision began turning red, and I stormed through the house in an attempt to find Carson. I recognized his name immediately. A member of our pack, 2 years older than Alec and I but still a lowly Omega. Constantly begging for some decibel of power was what Carson was known for. Have you seen Carson? My voice was a rough growl as I asked person after person. Finally, someone pointed me in the right direction. I stormed up the stairs, opening door after door until I found the person I was looking for. Carson sat in one of the bathrooms, looking into the mirror as he touched his head gingerly. Blood coated the tips of his fingers. If only he knew, he was going to bleed a lot more before the night was through. Carson locked eyes with me for just a split second before bolting towards the window. I was much faster, my senses heightened by experience and blood. I held Carson against the wall, my claws piercing his abdomen painfully. Blood pooled, seeping into his shirt. What did you do to Claire? My voice was calm, relaxed. I was past the point of blinding fury. This pup would die at my hands for the crime he committed. I didn't. Carson stammered, but it's hard to lie with a set of claws piercing your skin. I shoved them in a little deeper, hearing the squelch of his flesh tearing. Okay. Carson pleaded, his face already slick with sweat. His body was shaking, no doubt from the adrenaline coursing through his body. His body knew it was going to die, even before he did. What did you do? I repeated myself, moving my fingers slightly to bring just another ounce of pain. I just did what I was told, man. Carson whimpered, his lips trembling. His eyes were wide and searching, and I wondered if he truly thought he'd make it out of this alive. Did you rape her? I got close, my chest vibrating as I waited for his answer. No, Carson stammered. She hit me, got away, so sorry. Carson dissolved into a quivering, sobbing mess. It was such a shame when men couldn't retain the smallest shred of dignity in the face of death. So many people quiver in fear, soiling their pants as they beg for their lives. I refuse to die that way, stubborn and insolent until the end. As your alpha, I sentence you to death for the crimes against Claire, your Luna. The words were calm, but my eyes were bright with everything I truly felt. For just a split second, Carson's eyes lit up with realization. That didn't last long as I sunk my claws into his chest, severing his heart. Where are you? Alec's voice rang through my head. Came back to the party. 2nd floor, 5th door on the left. I replied. 1 minute later the bathroom door was being opened. Alec's eyes widened as he took in Carson's lifeless corpse. I walked to the sink, scrubbing his blood from my hands. Alec nodded, he was one of ours, right? I nodded, letting my claws retract into my hands. What did he do? Alec grimaced. He tried to rape Claire. I stated as calmly as I could. The words alone sent my wolf into a bloodthirsty rage. Claire was ours as much as we were hers. Said someone put him up to it. I'm afraid my anger got the best of me before I could ask who put him up to it. Alec looked frustrated, but sighed in understanding. I can't say I wouldn't have done the same in your shoes. Alec grimaced, but I would have been much cleaner about it. Alec and I were nearly identical in every way. The only thing that was different was our personalities. Both of us enjoyed killing, fighting, and defending what was ours. The only difference was I was more bloodthirsty than my brother, more feral in how I killed. Alec was more strategic. He could take anyone and anything down by simply looking them over for a moment. He preferred the smartest kill, while I simply sunk my teeth and claws into whatever bit of flesh I could manage. We will find out who put him up to it, brother, I growled under my breath. Until then, we keep an eye on Claire. Alec nodded, if she goes anywhere, we follow. Chapter 29. Claire. I left the note, changed my clothes in one of the many bathrooms and left for work. Today was a school day, but that didn't bother me. My boss was so desperate to find someone to cover an extra shift, he didn't even ask about school. I sent Tori a quick text, letting her know I didn't need a ride to work. She was in school, which forced me to walk. I never minded walking, it gave me time to think and clear my head. Unfortunately, I had too much to think about at the moment. I was sure Garrett would give me a ride to work, but I truthfully didn't want to ask. I felt smothered in his huge house, surrounded by people who didn't want me there, Lucy excluded. By the time I made it to the restaurant, my booted foot was aching. The pain wasn't as bad, but it was still annoying to walk on. One miracle is good enough, I told myself, thinking about my magically healing face. The next few hours, work was effortless. There were no kids from school in the restaurant, no one I knew sitting down for a meal. It was peaceful, and was the least stressed I felt this entire week. I could simply get lost in my thoughts and focus on not spilling any more drinks. Once 3 o'clock came around, new faces began showing up. Tori walked through the front door, her flaming hair a mess from the wind. She clocked in and gave me a sympathetic smile. I took a deep breath, knowing she'd want an explanation on why Garrett was here. And that was how the next few hours went. I explained my strange situation, and Tori did what she could to comfort me. She didn't give me any shit for missing school, claiming I had enough to deal with at the moment. I'm still planning our shopping trip, Claire. Tori moved her eyebrow. Rich father or not, we're getting you some new clothes. I rolled my eyes, new clothes are not at the top of my list right now. Clothes should always be at the top of every list. Tori shook her head, and mumbled to herself. She's right, you know. Thalia chimed in, giving me a shrug. You can't even wear clothes. I hissed, you're a disembodied voice in my head. Rude. Thalia scoffed, bet I still have better style than you. With Thalia's well-placed retort, she faded to the back of my mind. Why couldn't the voice in my head be nice? I mumbled to myself, no, instead I get a mean voice that just hurts my feelings and confuses me. Tough love. Thalia growled before disappearing again. I'm losing my mind. I nodded to myself, grabbing the drinks for another table. Acceptance was my best friend right now. After all, what could be done? The stress was clearly getting to me, muddling my thoughts and making me create this false persona. I wasn't very skilled in psychology, but I still knew when something was wrong with me. Kate and Alec came to the restaurant, but that didn't surprise me. It seemed they went out of their way to find me, to approach me. I hid like a coward in the kitchens, only coming out at the threat of losing my job. I rushed a tray of drinks out into the dining room, scanning for my customer's table frantically. A strong hand wrapped around my wrist, causing a surprised yelp to leave my L.P.S. The sparks bursting through my cells stunned me, sending a pleasurable wave of calmness into my body. I knew without looking who had touched me. I spun around much too fast, the tray of drinks toppling over onto my chest. Crap! I muttered, brushing the ice from my work shirt. This was the only work shirt I had left, forcing me to spend the remainder of my shift in a sticky shirt. Sorry, doll. Alec frowned, leaning down to grab the fallen tray while Kate grabbed the cups from the floor. The two of them stared at me in awe, and I cringed under their full attention. The way they looked at me set my teeth on edge, like a man seeing the sun for the first time. They stared at me in wonder, as if I were more than a plain girl covered in sugary soda. Thanks. I muttered, averting my eyes from their own. Looking into their dark eyes did things to my mind, placed images that I no longer wanted to see. My mind was trying to move on from them, my body just hasn't gotten the memo yet. You haven't been in school. Cade grimaced, the expression made my heart ache. Their dark eyes were plagued with worry as they roamed my face. Yet. I nodded, things have been kind of busy lately. Who was that man you were here with? Cade frowned, his voice sounding just a touch possessive. I could easily sense a double meaning to his question, but didn't have the strength to push further. They're ours, Claire. Thalia murmured in my head, and we're theirs. I ignored her and frowned at the twins. We don't mean to pry, doll. Alex shot Cade a hard look. It's all right. I shook my head, that was Garrett, my father. The two of them visibly stiffened, Alex's eyes widened in just the slightest. Cade's jaw clenched, the muscles moving temptingly. Your father. Alex stated, his voice a mix of confusion and denial. Unfortunately. I mumbled, couldn't leave well enough alone, had to come barging into my life. Excuse us, we will catch up with you later, sweetheart. Cade murmured gently, his eyes roaming over my face. At school preferably. I gave a weak nod, fighting the temptation to follow them out the front doors. I had no intentions on going to school, no matter how badly I wanted to see the twins. My gut twisted as my eyes followed the twins out the door, catching Grace's murderous stare in the process. I wasn't sure how much she had seen, but from the intensity of her glare I assumed it was enough. Autumn and the other girl was with them. I purposefully ignored Autumn's stare, refusing to look into her eyes. What Grace did was reprehensible, but what Autumn did was just as bad. I trusted her, and she led me into a trap. She had me drugged, beaten, and nearly raped. And for what? Tori insisted on taking Grace's table, something I would be forever grateful for. I laid extremely low until Grace had left, finishing the rest of my shift in a confused and slightly tormented haze. Friday. Repeated in my head like a life-saving mantra. Everything would be fine after Friday. No more Grace, Garrett, Autumn, Carson, or the drama and pain that followed. Tori drove me home at the end of our shift, the conversation light as she sped down dark road after road. After some slightly confusing directions, Tori dropped me off at Garrett's house. Oh, Tori cooed, looking up at the house. I wondered when they'd finish building this house. Your Garrett must have been waiting months for this place. I raised my eyebrow at Tori, confused by her remark. What do you mean? I frowned, Garrett just came to town a day ago. Tori gave me an uneasy look. My mom furnished and decorated the inside of this place, said some rich guy requested the house to be built months ago. My mind was racing at what Tori had said. Either her mom was talking about another rich guy, or Garrett had this house planned out months ago. Why would he choose here of all places? Did he know I was going to be here? I hopped out of the car and gave Tori a hasty goodbye wave. I was going to get some answers from Garrett, whether he liked it or not. It turns out, I didn't have to look very far. Garrett sat in the darkened living room, a glass of dark-colored liquid in his hands. My nose wrinkled as I watched him take a drink of what looked like alcohol. While Garrett looked nothing like Frank, the image was all too similar. Claire. Garrett cleared his throat, setting his glass on the table. I waited up for you. You didn't have to do that. I mumbled incoherently, setting my shoes in the closet near the front door. There's some things we should probably talk about. Garrett sighed, looking very much like an unwilling participant. I grimaced, can't they wait until the morning? I'm afraid not. Garrett gave me a sympathetic smile, an expression I was beginning to loathe. I've kept it from you for 17 years, I'd prefer not to wait another day. Fine. I nodded, my L.P.S. pressed together tightly. But I have a question of my own. I believe what I'm about to tell you will answer some of your questions. Garrett murmured, but, you may proceed. I grimaced at his strange choice of words, spoken like a true businessman I guess. This house. I nodded, looking around us. My friend's mom designed the inside, said it was requested months ago. It was you, wasn't it? Garrett never responded, but his eyes held much to decipher. He was avoiding my question for a reason, I was right. My side of the family is unique. Garrett began, brushing off my question completely. I wasn't sure you would inherit this particular trait, but it appears you have. Obviously. I rolled my eyes, heterochromia iridium isn't that uncommon. Ah yes, our eyes. Garrett paused, clearly taken aback. That is not the trait I'm referring to. I stood silent, I couldn't think of what else he might be talking about. You see, my side of the family are a different species from average humans. Garrett opened his mouth, and I struggled to comprehend the nonsense that flowed from his L.P.S. My side of the family are werewolves. Now half-bloods don't always develop that wolf side, but sometimes they do. Which brings me back to you, Claire. Garrett went silent for a minute, no doubt giving me time to process what he had just said. Werewolves. Fuzzy winter dogs that roamed the woods and ate animals. Not dogs. Thalia rolled her eyes, you were petting 2 werewolves the other day. You're really buying into this? I rolled my eyes at her, they were wolves. Freakishly mutated and calm wolves, but that's all they were. My mind was beyond trying to understand any of this. So being the slightly unhinged person that I am, I convulsed into laughter. Chapter 30. The laughter fell from my L.P.S. in waves, and I realized I hadn't truly laughed in so long. Garrett sat in his seat, a perplexed look forming on his face as he watched me. It was comforting to know the mental decline ran in the family, but didn't give me much hope for the future. My erratic laughter died down, and I was left taking a few deep breaths. Look, Garrett! I snickered, placing my hand against my mouth to stifle another wave of laughter. I think you need to get some help, which means I definitely need to get some help. Claire, confusion formed on Garrett's face. Did he really think I was going to believe that? Werewolves? He rips me from my life and confesses there's a world of magical creatures? This isn't a book, life isn't full of fantasy. You work, get over by people, try to survive and then die. Don't. I shook my head, I shouldn't even have to entertain this. I turned on my heel and stormed up to my bedroom. I got halfway down the hall when I realized I had no idea where my bedroom was. I remember Garrett telling me I could pick, but I simply didn't care enough to try. Excuse me. I frowned, walking down the hall to one of the cleaning ladies. She looked fairly young, and smiled up at me softly. Yes, miss. The woman smiled as she folded a pile of towels onto a thick metal cart. Do you know where my bedroom is? I pursed my L.P.S., feeling antsy being so out in the open. It would be too easy for Veronica or Caddy to find me. Yes, miss. The woman nodded, gesturing for me to follow. Mr. Garrett chose a room for you. He hopes it is up to par. She turned down the hall and opened the second door on the left, revealing what looked like a hotel suite. I scoffed as I looked at the size of the bedroom. This wasn't a bedroom, it was an apartment. All I needed was a kitchen and I'd never come outside. I locked the door behind me, checking a couple times to make sure it stayed put. My legs were groaning from the long shift I just worked through, but my paycheck would be well worth it. I refused to even entertain the idea of what Garrett told me. Thalia was grumbling angrily in my head, but I tuned her out. I made a long playlist of music in my mind, and went through each song one by one. By the time I was finished, I had taken a long shower and got ready for bed. I slept well into the morning, not even bothering to answer as a knock sounded on my bedroom door. The phone Tori had gotten me was set on my bedside table, her picture flashing on my screen. That was how I spent the next few days. I read books I've read 1,000 times, talked to Tori, and kept to myself. Of course Garrett tried to talk to me, to ask why I wasn't going to school, but I ignored his knocks and questions each time. Every few hours Lucy would bring me up a tray of food, but I wouldn't open the door until she left. I felt guilty, ignoring Lucy, but I knew Garrett would use her to get to me. A couple times she tried to convince me to leave the bedroom, to come and talk to her. While I was tempted, there was nothing to talk about. Garrett was clearly plagued with mental illness, and was trying to force his crazy thoughts on me. It must have been working to some extent, as Thalia continued to mutter snide comments at me. I slammed down one of the books I'd been reading. The words were floating around my head annoyingly, and I could practically recite each from heart. I was getting tired of reading the same books over and over, glancing at my phone whenever Tori texted. She texted a lot, which didn't surprise me. She wanted to know when I was coming back to school, something I'm sure the twins were wondering as well. I tried to placate her as much as I could, telling her I'd be back Monday. She reminded me very clearly that I promised to explain what happened to my face this Friday. I looked down at my phone, the calendar read Thursday 6:32 p.m. I could avoid Tori long enough, keeping what happened to myself. Or if I was feeling particularly rueful, I could tell her the truth. It wouldn't matter what happened, I'd be gone shortly after. It'd be nice imagining all sorts of things happening to Grace once Tori found out the truth. I'm sure Grace would look beautiful in a jail cell. Lucy knocked on my door 15 minutes later, letting me know a tray of food was placed outside my door. She tried to reason with me for the next 10 minutes, but eventually I could hear her soft footfalls retreat down the hallway. I sighed and opened my bedroom door, ready to pull the tray inside when I was met with an angry face. I hadn't run into Veronica or Caddy all week, refusing to leave my bedroom for anything. It was pleasant, not having to deal with their glares and sneers. Caddy behind my food tray, leaning against the wall. She was gorgeous, with her golden hair and dark eyes, but the sneer on her face ruined her features. She was well dressed, but her mother was the same. The two of them dressed like they were about to step on the runway at any minute. Do you know what it's like, living in the shadow of someone you've never met? Caddy snapped, her brown eyes narrowing as she glared at me. My L.P.S. parted in confusion. I knew she wasn't talking about me. Garrett ignored me for 17 years, I didn't have a shadow for her to live in. I have no idea what you're talking about. I stared at her, deadpan. It wasn't my fault she had daddy issues, nor was it my problem. I sympathized with her because her life shifted as well, but that didn't mean I'd let her walk all over me. You're the firstborn. Caddy snapped, and I visibly rolled my eyes. What is with you people? I grunted, firstborn? It doesn't even matter. Who gives a FK? My chest was heaving by the time I finished, but Caddy looked angrier than ever. Her brown eyes were now black with rage, and her lip was pulled back in a feral sneer. He tried to tell you and you wouldn't even listen. Caddy scoffed, some SHT Luna you'd make. You shouldn't even exist. Pathetic half-breed. Katie's words were confusing, and yet also felt like a slap in the face. Thalia was enraged, spewing obscenities in my mind. I could feel her pushing at the edges of my mind, almost like she was in a cage. You're all insane! I snapped, your dad and your stuck-up mother. You're not dragging me into this shit, I never wanted to be here in the first place. I slammed the door in her face, the food a forgotten thought in my mind. My stomach rumbled in protest, but I could hardly feel it. My mind was spinning with what Garrett had said. I spent the last few days pretending it never happened, but he even pulled his daughter into this mess. A few hours passed, and the sun finally set behind the forest line. The moon was quick to rise, casting its white light on everything. A knock sounded at my door, but I'd become attuned to ignoring it at this point. I didn't even look up as the knocking continued. I sat on a wide window seat, a forgotten book in my lap. My cheek pressed against the cool glass window as I looked out into the forest. I tried to imagine what Garrett had told me, imagine wolf people running around in the woods. I'd only seen a werewolf once in a movie, a grotesque and human-like creature who had claws and way too much body hair. That's not what we look like. Thalia grumbled, rolling her eyes. It worries me that we're already calling ourselves one of them. I sighed, rubbing my temples. I get it, you've been through some shit. Thalia huffed, but you can't keep locking people out. Sure, I can. I frowned. Last time I even thought about letting someone in, I was assaulted and nearly raped. Thalia went quiet as the sound of a door opening filled my bedroom. My head whipped over to the source. Garrett stood behind my open door, a silver key in his hand. Seriously? I grimaced, my eyes narrowing into a glare. Garrett stepped into my bedroom, that same regal air around him. The swirling aura that surrounded him gave him this feeling of authority, while his suits gave him the appearance. You've locked yourself away all week. Garrett moved his eyebrow at me, what did you expect me to do? Take a hint. I scoffed, leave me alone, let me go back to Melissa, disappear from my life again. Take your pick. Garrett seemed unfazed by my miniature temper tantrum. I was well aware that locking myself away all week was childish, but I didn't care. I had been an adult for so long, taking care of myself for so long. I deserved a moment of immature selfishness. Claire, whether you choose to believe me or not is your decision. Garrett closed the door behind him and paused. But sooner or later, you'll be forced to face the truth. Sure, totally. I nodded, I'll turn into some hairy creature and howl at the moon. We don't howl at the moon. Garrett rolled his eyes, the expression making him look a decade younger. I could see what Melissa saw in him all those years ago. Garrett was relatively handsome, with a thick head of hair and a sharp jawline. I don't need details. I shook my head, it's bad enough you're spouting this shit, but you have your daughter doing it too. Caddy. Garrett paused, his L.P.S. turning down in a frown. Unless you have yet another daughter. I pinched the bridge of my nose, then that would be the one. She's unhappy understatement. I rolled my eyes at him. I could feel his temper flare as the aura of power around him became much more hostile. I could feel the hairs on my arms stand, but I didn't feel afraid. I should have, Garrett looked frightening. And yet I didn't. Thalia sat uninterested as Garrett stood threateningly over us. Garrett didn't seem surprised that we weren't cowering back in fear. His eyes were burning with acceptance, even if his posture radiated anger. She will deal with it. Garrett snapped, his deep voice booming throughout the room. And you will deal with it. You are returning to school tomorrow, Claire. I allowed you some time to yourself, but you will leave this bedroom. I felt my L.P.S. pop open. Grandma had never been forced to yell at me before, as I wasn't a bad child. Melissa never tried to parent me, sparing me from that catastrophe. Garrett was clearly playing the part of the concerned father. The thought made me cringe. I'll leave the bedroom. I shook my head, but I don't want to go back to that school. You can either go to school, or I will drag you and the rest of my family back to my pack. Garrett growled, his thick arms crossing over his chest. Pack. I ignored that word, knowing it definitely had to do with wolves. Did he call his hometown a pack? You can't do that. I scoffed. Melissa has custody and I'll be 18 next year. Melissa no longer has custody. Garrett shook his head, his face remained hard. I've been busy this week, while you hid away from the world. It doesn't matter. I shook my head, I'd leave the day I turned 18. A year in my pack, you wouldn't want to leave. Garrett scoffed, you'd become the next Luna. Luna. I pursed my L.P.S. Caddy mentioned something about a Luna. Garrett stiffened and muttered something about Caddy. A Luna is the female leader of a pack. Garrett nodded, and I pretended not to be interested. She said I shouldn't have existed. I glanced at him before returning my gaze to the window. Care to explain that? Garrett was silent for a moment, the aura of anger that swirled around him diminished. Melissa wasn't my mate. Garrett's voice sounded hard, yet truthful. I had gotten her pregnant right before I met Veronica. Mate, I repeated, the word sounding strange on my tongue. And Veronica is your mate? She is. His voice was one tone, but I could hear the love and adoration in his words. I thought Veronica was B*H, but Garrett's words held such love for the woman. She's right then. I shrugged. The fact pained me a little, but this was all pain I had felt before. It made sense, why I never truly fit anywhere. Why Melissa never wanted me and Garrett stayed far away. Fate has a way of changing things. Garrett paused. Fate isn't kind, nor does it give us what we want. One day, I could handle one day. I'd survive school, grab my paycheck from the restaurant and plan my escape that night. I'll go to school. I nodded, my eyes glued on the forest outside the window. I want nothing to do with your pack, or your life. Chapter 31. Despite the gut feeling brewing within me, I swallowed down my bile and got ready for school. School was the last place I wanted to be, but somehow I knew I'd never escape if Garrett whisked me away to his pack. It was only one day. One day and I could run to work to grab my check, leaving this town behind only a few hours after. I texted Tori that night, letting her know to pick me up for school. She was practically ecstatic that I was coming back, making me feel even more guilty. Thalia questioned my every move, using every moment she could to plant doubt in my mind. What if Garrett's telling the truth? She huffed, frustrated after spending an hour arguing with me to no avail. He's not. I shook my head, I'm not buying it, it's just not real. You know deep down, Claire. Thalia sighed, you've always known there's been a piece of you missing. This is that piece. This is why you're so strong. You were born to rule. I wasn't even supposed to be born. I rolled my eyes, ignoring Thalia's words. I didn't like how sincere she sounded. Part of me wanted to believe I was destined for something great, but that would mean living with the people who had never wanted me in the first place. Was it worth living with Garrett, Caddy, Veronica, Grace, Autumn, Melissa, and even Frank? I don't think so. I gathered my completed homework, stuffing them in my backpack in frustration. I had no idea why I even bothered with the homework. By the end of the day I'd be a dropout, running away from my own family if you could call them that. I spent the night refining my plan, working through the smaller details. I'd head to school in a noticeable outfit, changing before I left during the night. I'd keep my face from any cameras and catch a bus to the next airport. I had been smart enough to remove most of my money from my debit card, keeping it tightly locked in a box under my new bed. I'd leave both cell phones behind and catch a flight as far away as possible. All I had to do was get through my last day of school. The morning rolled around much too fast. I should have been worried about Grace, worried about the twins. I couldn't explain why, but I wasn't. The prospect that this was my last day with any of them really put things into perspective. I slipped on the only other dress I owned, something I had only worn in public once or twice. It was simply too flashy for my taste. A heart-shaped neckline highlighted my full chest, the dress ending in waves against my thighs. The dress was a light shade of blue with short sleeves. I had always loved this dress, but hated the attention it brought. It made my light blue eye stand out bold against my brown one. I slipped on my usual white sneakers and flung my book bag over my shoulder. I had waited until last minute to leave my room, somehow finding my way downstairs with ease. I slipped into the kitchen, thankful Lucy was nowhere in sight. I rifled through one of the many cabinets, wrapping my hand around a plain bagel. I stuffed a piece into my mouth and bounded out the door. The drive to school was peaceful, and I had forgotten what today truly meant to me. If I pretended hard enough, today was like any other day. I was heading to school with Tori, another day of trying to figure out the confusing twins. Thalia's voice ripped me from that fantasy, reminding me of my insane plan. My mom wants to know when you'll be coming over again. Tori chuckled, tucking a fire-colored lock behind her ear. She's been hounding me about you non-stop. My heart nearly stopped, guilt flooding through my veins. What kind of friend was I? With a shake of my head, I set myself straight. I couldn't think that way. I couldn't force myself to stay to save the feelings of one person. I had dealt with the abuse for long enough. I deserved a way out. I owed that to myself. Sometimes, I nodded absent-mindedly, just gotta get situated with Garrett and all of that. You know you can talk to me, right? She smiled softly, the sight sending another sharp pain into me. I can't even imagine what that's like for you, but I can try. I know. I forced a smile in return. I just need some time. It's all confusing, and I'm not really sure what I want. He's trying to act like my dad, but he's not. He never has been. Tori did what she said she would. She tried to understand. She didn't tell me to give him a chance, to forget the past. She simply told me to do what felt right. I hoped she would forgive me one day, not that I would be around to witness it. Chapter 32. We pulled into the school and the first 2 classes of the day went as planned. None of the other students seemed to notice I was gone. My 3rd class was another story entirely. I had almost forgotten I sat with both the twins in this class. The moment I walked through the door, both of their eyes were on me. Their gazes burned into my skin, the guilt bubbling within me nearly made me nauseous. I walked slowly, my eyes guarded as I looked into their own. It seems the 2 of them had seen better days. Their eyes looked darker, almost black. Deep rings lined their eyes, making it look as though they needed a good night's sleep. Cade was as gorgeous as ever. His hair tousled on the top and short on the sides. His long-sleeve shirt clung to every dip and arch of his body. Alec looked stunning with his longer and tousled hair. His typical leather jacket was in place. They were sitting next to each other for a change, giving me a chance to spend the class without being touched. I needed to resist the pull I felt towards them, but now it felt stronger than ever. Something had definitely changed. The urge to be near them was not purely mental pain, it was now physical. My body ached, shivering at the longing I felt. I wasn't sure how I'd get past this class, but I was determined to try. "Well, hello, doll." Alec's dark eyebrow lifted, his obsidian-colored eyes roaming the dress I had chosen. My cheeks flared under their attention, but I chose to ignore his comment. "We heard you had quite the week." Cade spoke smoothly, his eyes running over my face. "Yes, I did." I nodded, keeping the conversation as bland as possible. "You moved in with Garrett," Alec quipped, and my heart fluttered. It made my insides warm when Alec called him Garrett. Everyone else had almost slipped up and called him my dad. "They know how you feel," Thalia murmured. "If you'd open up to them, you could feel their emotions too." "People don't feel each other's emotions." I rolled my eyes. If they did, Melissa and Frank would have never treated me how they did. Thalia sighed and retreated to the back of my mind, clearly tired of arguing with me. It's not like I had a choice. I frowned, my eyebrows furrowing together in a grimace. That must be quite the adjustment. Cade frowned, looking troubled. "How are you holding up, doll?" Alec's frown matched his brother's, and I felt myself stiffen in my seat. "I'm acclimating." I nodded. They both sounded so sincere, so conflicted with what I was going through. Something shuddered within me, something that linked me to these two brothers. I nearly gave in to that feeling, but I reminded myself why I couldn't. I couldn't see myself building a life here, one where Melissa and Frank were close by. I bottled my feelings, shoving them deep down. I could deal with them once I was out of this state altogether. I struggled to get through the class, struggled to keep my eyes from flickering to the twins. They made little comments, asked me little questions. I answered the best I could, keeping a tight hold on my emotions. The class ticked by slowly, their eyes leaving tracks along my body. I was out of my seat before the bell rang, scrambling to get to my next class. I was thankful Tori was in this class, keeping me safe from Grace. Alec approached the front of my desk the moment I sat down, a frown still played on his face. "You can talk to us, doll." Alec frowned, his dark eyes glinting sadly. "In case you ever need someone to talk to." I mumbled my thanks, ignoring the heated glare from Grace. I wouldn't let her glares hurt me any longer. I was safe here in school, surrounded by people. As long as I remained with other students, Grace couldn't hurt me. My fourth class passed, and I squirmed in my seat every time Alec glanced my way. Tori and I talked about nothing and everything. She didn't push me to talk about what was going on in my life, letting the topic of conversation change freely. I managed to get to gym early, heading into the locker room before everyone else. I changed quickly, my eyes peeled to each student that flocked into the locker room. I was just about to exit the locker room and head into the gym when a familiar face approached me. My stomach twisted in fear, but Thalia somehow stifled the emotion. A strange surge of strength washed through me. The strength wasn't physical, but mental. Just enough to get me through this without turning into a quivering mess. "Claire, I need to talk to you." Autumn spoke in a hushed tone, the words spewing from her mouth quickly. "You need to talk." I scoffed, storming past her before another word could leave her lips. Her soft hand wrapped around my wrist. Her grip wasn't tight, more pleading than anything. "Please Claire," she began, but I whipped around to face her. "You what?" I snapped, letting Thalia egg me on. Her anger mixed with my own, heightening my emotions to newfound levels. "You didn't mean to lure me into a party? You didn't mean to let Grace beat me? You didn't mean to almost let me get annoyed?" Autumn's mouth flopped open, and she fought for the words to say. I was drunk on my anger, ignoring the startled gazes from some of the other girls. "It's so good to know you didn't mean any of it," I snickered, ripping my wrist from her hand. "That completely excuses everything you did." Before she could say anything else, I stormed from the locker room. My blood was boiling the entire class, making my vision fill with a red tint. I couldn't get the disgusting metallic taste out of my mouth, only adding to my anger. We were playing volleyball yet again, only this time I didn't struggle. I wasn't hiding from the ball, waiting for the moment it hit my skin. I was seeking the ball out, smashing it over the net with ease. My movements weren't hesitant, my body knew what it was doing. Thalia was quite competitive, screaming expletives in my head the entire game. We had won, and I had successfully ignored the gazes of Alec and Cade all day. Autumn didn't try and approach me again, it seemed she finally learned to think for herself. Grace was in class, as angry as ever. Her murderous glare was on me the entire time, but somehow I ignored it. I knew I was safe with all these students around. I knew without a doubt, if we were alone she would most definitely end my life. The flicker of madness in her eyes attested to that. At the sound of the bell, we filtered back into the locker room. I slipped on my clothes and headed through the doors, walking down the hall to meet Tori at her locker. For just that split second, I had let my guard down. I was surrounded by students, unworried about who might approach me. A strong grip wrapped around my wrist, pulling me into an empty classroom. This situation was entirely too familiar as I stared into the eyes of Alec and Cade. Alec released my wrist, taking a step back before he closed the classroom door. A few students looked at us warily, their eyes flickering at the closed door. I wondered if any of them would grab a teacher, a small part of me hoped they wouldn't. "Doll, you've been avoiding us." Alec tsked, stalking forward. "I'm not avoiding anything." I shook my head, trying my best to make my voice sound convincing. My voice cracked at the end, proving the fallacy of my words. "Sure you aren't, sweetheart." Cade shook his head, his eyes flickering to his brother before he too began approaching me. "We know what you're feeling, doll." Alec smirked, something dangerous glinting in his eyes. "Stop fighting them," Thalia urged, but I couldn't focus on her at the moment. "Stop fighting us," Cade murmured, his large hands grasping my hips lightly. The contact sent a lightning shock through my skin, searing my insides wonderfully. I hadn't realized how badly my body craved the contact, as if it had been going through withdrawal this entire time. "We can't." The words were on the tip of my tongue, ready to flow from my lips. The words refused to be spoken, refused to drift out into the air. Cade's grip on my waist tightened as he pulled me towards him. He stepped back until he was able to sit comfortably in one of the many chairs scattered about. My body didn't hesitate, even as he pulled me onto his lap. My legs were open, straddling his lower body. I could feel my short dress ride up, but the only thing on my mind was Cade's touch. His hands gripped my waist tightly, as if he were afraid I'd slip away. Pleasuring yet relaxing. Alec came up behind me, pulling up his own seat as he stroked my long hair, brushing it to the side. My body had spent so long craving their touch that I couldn't force myself away. All of the inner screaming, all of the turmoil couldn't save me now. I had deprived myself for too long. Thalia wanted the twins, wanted me to give in to their touches. Let this be our goodbye. I murmured in my mind, letting my face drift closer to Tori, Cade, and Alec. Chapter 33. Giving in to their touch didn't ease the embarrassment I felt when it was over, or the blush that formed on my face. I wasn't embarrassed about what we had done, but how I had wanted them to do more. I was far too willing to go all the way, giving up the last piece of me I had. Each of them gave me a lingering kiss, one sweeter than I had ever anticipated. Their lips were soft against my own, moving slowly and with purpose. I had to physically tear myself from their side to leave the room. I was sure Tori would already suspect what happened, but she was also out there waiting for me. I walked quickly down the hallway, heading towards her locker. The halls were practically empty now, only a student or two lingering. I frowned when I turned the corner and spotted Tori's locker. She was nowhere in sight. A knot formed in my stomach. The closer I got to Tori's locker, the bigger the knot in my stomach grew. Just when I was 5 feet away, a hand clamped over my mouth. They were dragging me into an empty classroom. Their body felt small, and yet they were freakishly strong. My back met the wall, banging against a rack of whiteboard markers. Grace glared at me menacingly. The girl's losing it. Thalia shook her head. She's got crazy in her eyes. That's not helpful. I shook my head. Know how to fight? I thought I was just some voice in your head. Thalia rolled her eyes. You are, but you talk constantly. I pointed out, so talk now and help me. Didn't we already have a conversation? Grace narrowed her light eyes. They scanned my bare neck, igniting in anger as she noticed the deep purple marks from Alec's lips. And yet I see you around with them in one of the classrooms. My mouth opened a bit, apparently unable to form words. Embarrassment washed through me. Had she seen everything that happened? What was I going to say? I couldn't deny it. Grace seemed a lot more unhinged than normal. She glared daggers at me while murmuring to herself. Cade wouldn't even touch me after I slept with Dean. I don't see how he can stand to be near you after Carson had you. She mumbled, keeping me locked against the blackboard. Some part of me hoped Tori would show up after realizing I hadn't met her after school. I wondered how long it would take until she did come if she did. You're not ready for me to come out yet. Thalia grunted, but I'll help you with what I can. I resisted to make a comment, appreciating the support right now. Even if it did come from a voice in my head. And yet the two of them seem obsessed with you. Grace grimaced, overprotective and definitely overbearing. Something seemed to click in Grace's head. I could practically hear it as the link formed in her head. Of all people. Grace scoffed, it had to be you. And both of them? How could someone like you get a break like that? I have no idea what you're talking about. I snapped, not feeling as scared as I did last time. You really don't, do you? Grace snickered but didn't stalk forward. It doesn't matter. I shook my head, I'm leaving, you can have them. Thalia growled in my mind. Telling Grace could have ruined my plans, but I doubted that. She's been wanting me to leave this entire time. Leaving? Grace grinned, and for just a split second she was looking at me like her best friend. She looked like a good person when she smiled, you could never tell what was hidden underneath it all. When? Tonight. I nodded, fear churning in my gut. You've been planning this for some time, haven't you? Grace giggled. You should have just said so, silly. I would have never had to sick Carson on you. Bile churned in my gut, making me feel nauseous. Grace had completely changed from her murderous self. She acted as though it had never happened, talking about what she did as though it were some game. It wasn't on my mind at the time. I choked out. How could I think about anything when I was being assaulted? It happens. Grace waved it away, as though it happened every day. This is great. You can't tell anyone. I shook my head. My Garrett would try and stop me. I'd never do that. Grace shook her head, that crazy glint was gone from her eyes. Need some money? She's insane. Thalia shook her head. Now do you see why I want to leave? I frowned. No, Thalia shook her head, unless you want to take Alec and Cade with you. Not happening. I promised. There wasn't a chance I planned on taking money from Grace. The thought of taking money from her put a sour taste in my mouth. I wanted no part of her when I left. No, I shook my head. I've been saving for a while. Good, good. Grace grinned. Go somewhere far. Grace took a few steps closer, her face inches from my own. Oh, and Claire. Grace's voice was like honey and silk, hiding the wasps beneath. Don't come back, ever. I will take my anger out on Tori, and then I will move on to you. And I always keep my word. Threatening me was one thing, but threatening Tori was uncalled for. Tori hadn't posed any sort of threat to Grace. She was simply using her to get back at me. I knew Tori could handle herself, but what if Grace had backup like she did with me? Could Tori fight against 3 people? I didn't think she could. Alec and Cade were just wealthy teenagers, but they couldn't stop Grace. It seemed she was just as wealthy as they were. I won't. I promised, my stomach sinking at my own words. Chapter 34. Grace had let me leave the classroom without any hassle. Her murderous and slightly unhinged demeanor faded as soon as I told her the truth. She even had the audacity to chat with me, asking about my plans once I had left. What frightened me more than her bold threat against Tori was the way she changed with the flip of a switch. I gave rushed, one-worded answer in a hurry to leave the classroom. I had just enough time to mask the fear and disgust on my face before Tori found me in the halls. She had already grabbed what she needed from her locker, wandering around in search of me. Her face contorted in confusion as she saw the heat fill my cheeks. Understanding flashed in her eyes as they traveled down my neck. Without a doubt, she was thinking of Alec and Cade. I sat quietly as Tori drove the 2 of us to the restaurant. We both ran in, grabbing our checks from the manager on duty. I'm still waiting for that explanation, you know. Tori's orange eyebrow lifted as she shot me a stern look. My stomach flipped and a chill spread over my skin. I had promised Tori explanations for a lot of things, explanations I couldn't give. I had planned to leave a note for her when I left, one explaining what Grace had done to me. Grace's threat against Tori made me question whether that was the right decision or not. While Tori could handle herself, Grace was incapable of thinking clearly. It was just another thing I would need to think on. While I wanted nothing to happen to Tori, it was eating me alive that Grace would get away with this. She had successfully chased me out of town, not that I hadn't been planning it regardless. I couldn't see what telling Tori would hurt. I would explain everything to her, giving her ample warning what Grace was capable of. I could only hope she kept the information to herself, keeping her safe from Grace. I'll give it to you. I coughed uncomfortably. I'll call you tonight. I wasn't sure if I'd be able to tell Tori what happened over the phone. My voice cracked and weakened any time I tried to speak about it. Bile would rise in my throat when I thought about my swollen and busted face. I'm holding you to that. Tori's lips were pressed together tightly. I'll call you around 8, Mom's having a dinner party with our neighbors. That sounds fun. I forced a lopsided grin to my face, ignoring the pinpricks of guilt that settled under my skin. You're more than welcome to join. Tori chuckled, giving me a playful eye roll. It'll be more eventful than what you're doing tonight. You're right about that. I laughed hollowly. You're going to hurt people when you leave, Claire. Thalia murmured in my mind, Tori's one of those people. People have done nothing but hurt me. I grimaced, I deserve more than this than living in fear with people I hardly know. You'll come back to them, Claire. Thalia murmured, her voice growing silent. I know you will. I knew exactly who them were. Alec and Kate's faces flashed into mind, the feel of them still lingered on my skin. Tori and I stopped by one of the banks in town. The two of us cashed our checks. I placed my wad of money deep in my book bag, eager to add it to what I had saved up. Taking money from Grace had been an offer I hadn't anticipated, but had no qualms refusing. Taking any form of help from Grace filled me with a sick sense of disgust. Tori dropped me off at Garrett's house before heading to her own. She shot me one last stern glance, concern flickering in her eyes. I mustered up my strength and gave her a bright smile. Tori hadn't asked about our shift at work tomorrow, and I hadn't mentioned whether I'd be there. Come tomorrow, everyone important would know the news. Garrett was there the minute I stepped into the house. His crisp suit irritated me, as did his dark slicked back hair. His aura of poise and superiority grated away at my nerves. If only everyone knew the insanity that was hidden beneath his glamorized facade. I would like for you to attend dinner with us. Garrett cleared his throat, his mismatched eyes staring down at me. For a moment, I wondered if people thought the same thing when looking into my eyes. My eyes were an exact replica of Garrett's. One eye was a light blue, lighter than the sea or sky. The other eye was a rich brown, hints of honey and gold thrown into the mix. The sight was hypnotizing, both eyes bright and unique in their own way. Dinner. I wasn't asking a question, yet the word fell from my lips regardless. The last thing I wanted to do was eat dinner with his family. His wife and daughter clearly hated me. As if reading the contempt in my eyes, Garrett shifted to the other foot. They will learn to accept you, Claire, but you must make an effort. I need to make an effort. I scoffed. I hadn't tried due to the clear distaste his wife and daughter had for me. How could I make an effort when the two of them refused? I understand they can be difficult, but this is as new to them as it is to you. Garrett frowned, compassion filling his eyes as he spoke of his wife. After dinner, there is something I would like to show you. I frowned, hoping it wouldn't be another fairytale. Garrett clearly noticed the reluctance on my face but chose not to comment. I had no choice but to indulge him. Come the end of the night, I would be gone. Garrett told me to come down to the dining room in an hour, and that dinner would be ready soon after. I thundered up to the bedroom, wasting no time as I closed the door behind me. I grabbed a medium-sized duffel bag from the closet and began packing some clothes. I rolled my clothes up tightly, saving as much room as possible. Apart from clothes, a picture or two and all my money, there was nothing left to pack. I wanted to bring toiletries but decided they would take up too much room. I stuffed a couple granola bars and water bottles into the bag. It had been a last-minute decision to raid part of the large kitchen to find some snacks to bring. I wasn't sure when I'd be eating next. I had thought of nearly everything when it came to my escape. I would change into something I hardly wore, making it harder to be identified on cameras. I'd keep my hat and hood pulled up, blocking what parts of my face I could manage. The phone Tori had gotten me would have to be left behind, but I could manage without a phone. I emptied out my bank account, planning to use cash for everything I needed. I didn't bother changing for dinner. If anyone reported me missing, they would remember the dress I had worn today. I walked down the stairs quickly, wanting to get this entire afternoon done with. Garrett had already taken his place at the table, Veronica by his side. Katie sat beside her mom, a permanent sneer on her slender face. All eyes were on me as I walked into the dining room. My face heated under the stares. I couldn't help but feel I had interrupted something. Garrett's face held anger as he looked at his wife. It was clear they were having a heated conversation about something. I could only guess what that something was me. "I'm glad you joined us, Claire." Garrett smiled. While the emotion looked genuine, I couldn't get past the irritated stares coming from Katie and Veronica. I felt like I was interrupting their family dinner, barging in on something I had no business with. Garrett controlled the conversation, including me at every chance. He asked about my childhood, classes, and interests. I gave answers where I needed, never once looking into Katie or Veronica's sharpened eyes. Garrett seemed genuinely interested in my past, something I wasn't keen on sharing. His eyes filled with guilt as I talked about my grandma, the woman who had raised me. He could hear the love and gratitude dripping from my voice as I talked about her, along with the contempt I held as I talked about Melissa. I finished my dinner in a rush, ready to retreat upstairs. My stomach dropped when Garrett stood from the table and motioned for me to follow. Lucy shot me a wide smile as she began gathering the empty plates. I had forgotten Garrett wanted to show me something, only wasting what little time I had. I followed Garrett silently as he led me out the back door. The garden in their backyard was beautiful, overflowing with brightly colored flowers. As we stepped into the yard, I could smell their sweet aromas. Katie did all of this. Garrett smiled proudly at the flowers. His entire demeanor seemed to change when he spoke of his family. The thought sent a small wave of pain washing over me, one I pushed to the side and ignored. "Really?" I scoffed in disbelief. I couldn't imagine prim and proper Katie getting on her knees to garden. The image didn't sit right in my mind. Wouldn't she be afraid of chipping a nail? Garrett did something unexpected, he laughed. His entire face lit up as his chest rumbled. "She really doesn't look like the type, does she?" Garrett chuckled, one of his hands smoothing the material of his suit. "Not at all." I shook my head, unsure what to make of this entire situation. "Why are we out here? It can't be to talk about gardening." Garrett's smile fell, a serious expression on his face. I regretted the words as soon as they came from my lips. "It isn't." Garrett shook his head. "I understand I may have chosen the wrong moment to explain your heritage. Instead of telling you, I should have shown you." The thought of entertaining this had anger bubbling in my veins. Garrett could see the reluctant frustration forming on my face and jumped into action. Before I could turn my back on him, a sharp snapping sound rang out through the backyard. My eyes were wide, my mouth gaping as I stared at Garrett. It sounded as though he snapped his own spine in half. His eyes were wide as he looked on at me, a splotch of hair began forming on his neck. "Watch him, Claire," Thalia murmured, urging me to keep my eyes on Garrett. I wasn't sure I could pull them away if I tried. The entire process was quick, but my body had long ago gone into shock. I could only stand and stare as my Garrett turned into a large, silver wolf. The wolf was bigger than any wolf I had ever seen, easily the size of a full-grown bear. The animal's eyes were just like Garrett's, just like my own. One a bright and startling blue, the other a deep golden brown. Anger, frustration, disbelief, horror, and fear were bouncing through me like an aggressive mosh pit. My dinner sat heavily in my stomach, my blood turning cold at the sight. Garrett the wolf stalked forward slowly, sitting on its haunches when it was only a few feet away. I wasn't sure how long we stood like that for. It could have been hours for all I knew. My eyes were locked on him the entire time, those 6 conflicting emotions swirling within me. Something else began to form inside of me, acceptance. Some part of me, no matter how small, knew Garrett was telling the truth. It was as though I had been missing a piece of myself, and now I was finally whole. The thought should have filled me with joy, right? Wrong. I was terrified. Terrified of Garrett, terrified of myself. The truth rattled in my head, an understanding formed in my mind. I refused to address those thoughts, knowing what they meant. Thalia wasn't just a voice inside my head, she had been there all along. There was something else that bubbled in my mind, something I had tried to forget. I had met 2 wolves before, both eerily similar to Garrett. 2 wolves, identical in color and size. Chapter 35. As much as I wanted to deny the truth, it was sitting right in front of me. I couldn't help but do a mental check over my own body. I didn't feel different. Apart from Thalia's intrusive voice, I felt nearly the same as I always had. It would explain why my face had healed so quickly. You would think I'd be excited, but I wasn't. Turning into one of these creatures was the last thing I wanted. I needed normalcy. Sure, some small part of my mind wondered if I could use this against Grace. As much as I wanted to feel guilty over that, I couldn't. I was yanked from my thoughts by the ringing of a cell phone. The cell phone in my hand was buzzing, a picture of Tori lighting up the screen. "I'll call you back in 10. I answered, ending the phone call without another word. My eyes were still locked on the giant wolf on Garrett. Garrett walked over to a cluster of trees nestled in their backyard. I watched on in silence as Garrett returned to his human form. A pair of sweatpants hung on the lower portion of his body. His suit had been torn to shreds during his transformation. "I don't want this." Those were the first words that left my lips, followed by, "You don't even know if I can turn into a wolf." "I've never turned into one before." Instead of Garrett's face contorting in anger like I suspected, his eyes held sympathy. "I don't need to watch you shift to know what you are, Claire," Garrett murmured, leading the 2 of us back inside. My body was on autopilot. Half of me wanted to run, to get away from Garrett and his strange family as soon as possible. The other side of me was smart, knowing if I ran now, he would only catch me. "I can feel your wolf." Garrett sighed, "She's inside of you, she will help you shift when it's time." "I tried to tell you, Claire." Thalia frowned, "We can't shift yet, but when we do, we're going to need Alec and Cade." "What's so important about Alec and Cade?" I grimaced, my heart thundering at the mention of their names. "They're our mates, Claire." Thalia rushed the words out in an exasperated huff. "What is a mate?" I spoke before thinking, gaining Garrett's full attention. "What makes you ask?" Garrett's lips pressed together tightly, his eyes intense as he looked at me. "My wolf mentioned the term." I shifted uncomfortably. The truth coupled with Garrett's interrogating stare made me want to flee. "They're like soulmates." Garrett spoke slowly, his own eyes glazing over as he thought of his wife. "And Veronica, is she your mate?" I paused, discomfort and fear swirling in my gut. She is. Garrett nodded, clearly reading the discomfort in my eyes. Garrett had a child with another woman, one who wasn't his mate. Thalia recoiled at the thought, showing her clear disgust. I see. My voice sounded weak, my head churning with the overwhelming amount of information I was being forced to process. That changes nothing, Claire. Garrett grimaced, you are my firstborn, which means my pack will someday belong to you. I wanted to scream, to shout at Garrett until I turned blue in the face. I didn't want a pack, a wolf, mates, or anything else that came. I wanted a normal life with people who wouldn't hurt me, threaten me, or leave me in a perpetual state of fear and anxiety. Some people spend their entire lives waiting for something like this to happen. Some kind of strange, magical calling that takes them out of their boring world. I wasn't one of those people. I wanted a normal life and all that it entailed. I paused. What would denying everything do? Garrett would continue to push, forcing me to accept some planned-out future he had. I need some time. I gulped, my eyes darting to the staircase. I understand, Claire. Garrett frowned, his eyes softening in the slightest. I was raised knowing what we are, you weren't. I'll give you the time you need, but please think on what I've said. I will. I nodded, telling the lie effortlessly. I retreated to my bedroom on shaky legs, fumbling to close the door behind me. I slipped out of the clothes I had worn to school. I threw on a long-sleeve shirt, followed by my heaviest jacket and a dark pair of jeans. Melissa and Frank wouldn't be able to identify me by the clothes I wore. Melissa never paid enough attention and Frank was always too wasted to notice. I swung my backpack over my shoulder and placed the phone to my ear. It rang a total of 2 times before Tori picked up the other end. What happened? Tori frowned, you sounded kind of flustered. Nothing important. I shook my head, Garrett wanted to talk to me. Oh, I see. Tori frowned, understanding clear in her voice. She knew how I felt about Garrett. It was one of the only things I could openly tell her. Yet. I cleared my throat. My heart was hammering in my chest, anxiety racked my entire body. I was becoming antsy, wanting to leave as soon as I could. I'd have to wait another hour, until I was sure Garrett had left the lower part of the house. I hoped he didn't have some kind of super hearing, but it was too late to change my plan. Now about that explanation. Tori paused, clearly dealing with her own unease. What happened to your face? For a moment, I wasn't sure what to say. Did I really want to do this? I couldn't see how it would hurt, as I'd be gone before morning. Whatever happened to Grace after I left wasn't my fault, but didn't Tori deserve warning against Grace's threat? Grace happened. I cleared my throat, fighting back the tears of frustration that formed behind my eyes. She didn't like that I was talking to Alec and Cade, so she had Autumn and her other friend help. Oh my God, Claire! Tori's voice was a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, disbelief, shock, sympathy, and hate. I knew someone hurt you. I never thought Grace would go that far. I need to tell Tori, do me a favor. I clamped my eyes shut, pinching the bridge of my nose. I knew she would react this way. All I had to do was delay her for just a few hours. She could tell whoever she wanted in the morning. What? I could hear the frown on Tori's face. You better not ask me to keep this a secret. She seriously hurt you, Claire. She can't just get away with it. I know. I choked out, wishing I could tell her the rest. I wouldn't be able to fight back the tears if I told her more. They would overtake me, turning me into a pile of mush. Just wait until morning to tell anyone, for me please. Tori let out a long sigh, and I could almost see the look of frustration on her face. Fine, I'll wait until morning. Thank you. I breathed, remembering I had something else to say. There is something else. She threatened you. Said she would come after you if I told anyone. She threatened me. Tori scoffed, her voice filling with heat. I just wanted to give you a heads up. I frowned, just be careful around her. I think she's kind of losing it. Whatever it is, Grace lost it a long time ago. Tori chuckled dryly. Don't worry, Claire. Grace won't get her claws on me. After ending the phone call with Tori, I was left with an hour to mull everything over. It was an hour I didn't want to wait but had no other choice. It gave me time to think about everything. I didn't want to think over what Garrett had said. I wanted to shove it all deep down and never let it see the light of day. What Thalia had said about mates struck a chord within me. Alec and Cade were our mates. Typically, wolves only have one mate. Thalia's voice was soft, we have two. I never wanted one to begin with. I fought against the stabbing pain in my chest. An hour passed and I stood at my bedroom door in silence. My hand was only inches away from the handle. Once I opened this door, I wouldn't turn back. I'd change my own life, finally live it the way I chose. My bedroom door swung open, and I stepped into the hallway. My heart dropped to the floor as I met Katie's light eyes. Her eyes narrowed, eyeing me suspiciously. Whatever she was going to say caught in her throat. Her eyes widened as she took in the bag over my shoulder and the clothes I was wearing. Her eyes flickered down the hall, and back to me. He's in his office. Katie murmured, you have 15 minutes before my mom goes back downstairs. Without saying anything more, Katie retreated into her bedroom. I stood there gaping at her bedroom door, replaying the words she had said to me. She was helping me. Of course, it was for her own selfish reasons, but I appreciated it, nonetheless. Her tone had been soft, kind even. I wanted to laugh dryly at the number of people who wanted me gone. It seemed like the number continued to grow. I crept downstairs and out of the house easily. I planned on calling a cab with my old flip phone, the one Melissa had gotten me. I planned on walking to the little corner store, the one I had visited when we first moved here. I would call a cab to pick me up at the store, taking me to the nearest bus stop. Fear does things to a person's mind. It dulls all thoughts of reason, dulls anything good and supportive. Fear consumes and burns until there's nothing left. Fear had formed in me the night Grace attacked and had been boiling and festering ever since. Fear put you in a constant state of fight or flight, pushing everything else to the back of your mind. I wasn't thinking of Tori, Alec, Cade, or anyone else. I was thinking of myself, of running from the fear that scorched my insides. Even as I stepped out of the cab, and walked through the doors to the bus terminal, I was only thinking of myself. Chapter 36. Thalia had been silent up until we reached the bus terminal. I found myself staring at the brightly lit board, times and dates flashing through my mind. I walked over to the clerk, I pulled a couple bills from my bag. I couldn't help my wandering gaze, my eyes flickering towards the multitude of cameras in the bus terminal. It was a silly thought, one driven by paranoia and fear. What if they managed to find me? Melissa and Frank were useless and would spare no effort searching for me, it was Garrett I worried about. From the look of his crisp suit and his large house, it was obvious he was wealthy. Would Garrett put forth the effort and money into finding me? I wasn't sure. I had to pay extra for the soonest bus to Atlanta, GA. It would take 3 hours to get to Atlanta. Thankfully there were no stops involved. Anxiety and paranoia clung to me along with the crisp nighttime air. My foot tapped relentlessly, my eyes locked on the clock ticking away in the terminal. I had discarded my old flip phone at the corner store before stepping into the cab, another precaution I decided to take. Thalia had been quiet the entire time, only speaking up as the bus pulled into the terminal. "Don't do this, Claire," Thalia pleaded, her voice as stressed and nervous as my own. "I know why you want to leave, I understand. I'm telling you it's the wrong choice. I want to find that out for myself." I grimaced. I never had a choice, not with anything. If this is a mistake, I'll find out on my own. "I won't help you do this, Claire." Thalia's voice sounded tired and sad, almost making me regret my decision. "You'll be on your own." "I've always been on my own," I murmured, walking over to the coach bus. The smell of cleaner and air freshener filled my nose. "It's time I make my own decisions." Thalia went silent, and I couldn't help but feel as though I had lost a part of myself. The silence was deafening. It was then I realized how much I had gotten used to her voice, even in the short days I had known her. "You're doing the right thing," I murmured to myself, stepping onto the near-empty bus. "I'll learn from my mistakes like anyone else." At least I finally had the freedom to choose. My stomach was doing flips as I walked down the narrow aisles of the bus. Only a few people lingered, clearly impatient for departure. I sat down in one of the empty seats, placing my duffel bag at my feet. My fingers twitched impatiently, the hairs on my arms raising. Fear and anxiety had become my closest companions this past week. They followed me around, their silky voices hissing in my ears. I could feel the handle of the seat crunch beneath my death grip. I only released my grip as the bus pulled out of the terminal, and headed towards the highway. I purposefully averted my eyes, ignoring the large crack I had caused on the handle. 3 hours of nothing but silence. Dull music played through the speakers of the bus. My cheek pressed against the cool window of the bus, a poor attempt at stilling my nerves. Just as my eyes began to close and sleep began to take me, a noise close by startled me. Walking down the narrow aisle was a young-looking guy, one whose dark eyes were locked on my own. His hands brushed against the scratchy material of each seat until he reached the one I currently occupied. A slew of thoughts ran through my mind, all driven by paranoia. Did Garrett send this guy? Did he know I had left? Did Caddy tell what she saw? Of course not. I thought to myself dryly, it hasn't even been an hour. They probably think I'm asleep. The guy stopped once he reached my seat, his dark eyes looking down on me. The guy was good-looking in a rugged sort of way. His hair was a light shade of brown, wavy and just barely grazing his broad shoulders. Normally a guy like this would send a rush of butterflies swarming through me, but I felt nothing. Only two faces popped into mind. Identical features, full lips, long lashes, sharp jawlines. This guy had nothing on Alec and Cade. With great force, I willed the two of them from my mind and ignored the sharp pain that ran through my chest. Thinking of them would only cause me unneeded pain. Mind if I sit here? The guy grinned softly, showing just a hint of his blinding smile. Sure. I mumbled, unsure if he was able to hear me. The guy sat in the seat beside me, cramming his book bag between his legs. Whatever kind of cologne he was wearing swirled around me, filling my nose. It was a pleasant smell, woodsy with a hint of something sweet. Another sharp pain rattled me, reminding me I had smelled better. I've been on this bus for 4 hours now. The guy chuckled, giving a tired shake of his head. I watched from the corner of my eye as his wavy hair shook and tickled against his shoulders. You seem like you could use some company. Where are you coming from? I found myself asking, purely to get my mind off of everything else. My voice was stronger than I expected it to be. While I felt weak inside, my voice conveyed not an ounce of fear or worry. Florida. The guy chuckled. It was then I noticed his tan skin, gold and kissed by the sun. It's been a long ride. Hell, I still got more to go. Where are you headed to? I'm not sure yet. I chuckled dryly, I'm still figuring that bit out. You look a little young to be riding the bus by yourself. The guy smirked, his chocolate eyes playful. I'm 19 if that makes you feel better. I shrugged, the lie leaving my lips effortlessly. Lying had become something I was good at. Liar, liar, liar. The word rang out in my head, filling my stomach with guilt. I'm just messing with you, but I do feel a little better. The guy chuckled, flashing me a 1,000,000-watt smile. A smile like that would have sent blush rushing to my face, instead it had no effect. What brings you all the way from Florida? I found myself asking. Part of me felt guilty for talking to this guy. I could have cared less who he was, or what brought him here. All I wanted was a distraction, something to keep me from drowning in my own anxiety. Visiting my mom. My dad's sick and she needed my help. The guy shrugged, his lips twitching into a frown. I'm taking the year off from college anyway, so I don't mind lending a hand. I'm sorry about that. I nearly cringed at how insincere I sounded, my words coming out clipped and hard. Do you like Florida? Oh, I love it. The heat, the sun, the ocean. The storms are a downer, but you can't have everything. The guy shrugged, giving a chuckle. It seems he hadn't noticed my insincerity, or he hadn't cared to point it out. I've never been to the ocean before. I murmured thoughtfully, wondering if I could catch a flight somewhere near the ocean. Even living in California for most of my life, I had never stepped foot on a beach. When I lived with my grandma, we were too far from the ocean to make the long drive. I had never thought about it until now. Never been to the ocean. The guy scoffed, his hand over his heart as though I had personally offended him. Have you lived in Georgia your entire life? There's beaches in Georgia. I used to live in California, never had the chance to go to the beach. I chuckled dryly. Have you thought about heading back to California? The guy asked, his brown eyes pooling with curiosity and sincerity. I actually haven't. I shrugged, it's a long trip, and there's too many memories there. What I didn't mention was that if anyone looked for me, California would be the first place they would look. Melissa wouldn't hesitate to tell Garrett I used to live in California. California was too obvious. I wanted to live somewhere no one knew my name. California is a huge state, but it wasn't what I was looking for. I understand that. The guy nodded, and I believed him. His eyes held a shadow within them, one that felt oddly familiar. My name's Justin, by the way. Amber. I nodded. More lies. Liar, liar, liar. Another surge of guilt rushing through me, Tori's face popping into my mind. I couldn't help but wonder how long it would take for the overwhelming emotions to fade. When would my own guilt fade? When would the cruel voice in the back of my mind silence? Well, Amber, I hope you find what you're looking for. Justin smiled, one that held a similar pain. Some small part of me wondered what ghosts haunted him, what the cruel voice in his own mind might whisper. I do too. I murmured, forcing my mind to part from the past and think towards the future. Justin accompanied me all the way to Atlanta, GA. I did most of the listening as Justin talked, telling me about his life. He was heading to North Virginia, to his mom's small ranch house. He had traveled to Florida for college, the waves calling his name. He had even participated in a couple surfing competitions, earning second place in one of them. I had learned much about Justin, yet refused to give much on myself. Justin had asked me what hobbies I might have, making me stumble and fall into uncomfortable silence. What hobbies did I have? School, homework, working, saving money. These things were not hobbies, they were not enjoyable. The realization was like a punch in my stomach. I had no hobbies, no passions. There was nothing I truly enjoyed doing. I never had the time or security to explore the things I cared for. Such a simple question caused such turmoil within me. Once we reached the terminal and hopped off the cramped bus, I asked Justin to call a cab for me. After wiping away the confusion on his face, he pulled a phone from his pocket. I had lied again, claiming my phone battery had died and my charger was left at home. Justin gave me a reassuring smile and a wave as I hopped into the cab. I returned his wave, but I couldn't force a smile to form on my face. Part of me wondered if I would ever smile again. Of course, I will. I scoffed to myself, the silence in the cab was deafening. I need to feel secure and safe first, happiness will come later. I told myself that lie up until I arrived at the Atlanta, GA airport. Join our Facebook and WhatsApp group for more updates, link is given in description. Rest audiobook will be continued in next episode.